Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Headlights idle where Park Drive meets City Island Road on a late Wednesday, September 17, 2025. The bend is familiar to anyone who drives out to the water, a quiet approach, limited lighting, a place you can ease a car onto the shoulder without drawing attention. Inside the vehicle, a 30-year-old registered nurse, Antonella Contreras Linares, known to friends as focused and reliable, bleeds from multiple stab wounds. The man in the driver's seat tells anyone who will listen that two guys on a moped came out of nowhere. In waterfront corners of the Bronx, incidents like this do more than shock a neighborhood, they challenge the story of how it happened. This is not a dramatization. It is a step-by-step account of what investigators would later treat as one scene, one timeline, and one chain of movement. The car doesn't wait for an ambulance. It heads north to Montefiore New Rochelle Hospital. Hospital intake clocks the arrival. Clinicians work the trauma the way they always do, airway, breathing, circulation, but the injuries are catastrophic. Antonella is pronounced dead. The man's forearm shows a cut that will also be documented. He repeats the same narrative, a brief stop near the junction, a robbery attempt, a knife, a struggle, then the drive. From the start, several anchors are fixed. Date and time, evening of September 17th. Geography, the pullover zone at Park Drive and City Island Road, Rodman's Neck on one side, the City Island Bridge approach on the other. Transport, private vehicle to the hospital. Those points matter because every next question depends on them. Where exactly did the stabbing occur? Who was present? What shows up on cameras near the bend and along the route in and out? Which businesses or traffic poles might carry usable footage inside that narrow window? Victimology is not just biography, it is context. Antonella worked at Mount Sinai Morningside. Colleagues described her as steady under pressure. That tells investigators something about baseline behavior, how she moved through a day, how she communicated, who expected to hear from her that night. If a plan to have dinner on City Island existed, messages, maps history, and call records should reflect it. If a robbery happened where the driver says it did, camera canvases and potential passerby accounts should line up with the timeline. A first pass on any case like this stays unemotional and exact. Scene control identifies where a car could safely stop, how long it likely idled, and whether any fresh drag, transfer, or cast-off patterns exist near the shoulder. The vehicle becomes its own scene, swabs, prints, blood distribution inside the cabin. That is not speculation, that is standard. The hospital record becomes a clock. Intake times and clinician notes help backsolve the attack window near the junction. Early public chatter frames the event as a street crime involving a moped. That framing is common when details are scarce and fear is high. But an investigator's rule of thumb applies. The first story is the one you test hardest. If a robbery crew really rolled up at that spot, there should be corroboration, headlights, silhouettes, a two-up scooter on a camera somewhere. And if there isn't, the absence itself becomes part of the file. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. For now, this case begins here, a single car, a single junction, a single drive to a hospital. A nurse whose last evening started like any other. And a claim that will either hold under evidence, or not. The account given at the hospital is straightforward, a quick stop near Park Drive and City Island Road on the evening of September 17, 2025, two men on a moped approach the vehicle. A knife appears, the woman is stabbed, the man is cut trying to defend her, he then drives north to Montefiore New Rochelle Hospital. It is recorded, repeated, and logged. From an investigative standpoint, that story triggers a standard sequence: lock the time, lock the route, test the claim. Hospital intake provides the first anchor. Staff record arrival, triage notes, and treatment attempts. Those timestamps become the basis for back-calculating the latest possible moment of the assault near the City Island approach. Detectives measure the realistic drive time from the bend at Park Drive/City Island Road to the hospital at that hour, accounting for lights and typical traffic. If the elapsed time from alleged attack to intake is incompatible with the claimed sequence, too short for the drive, or oddly long without explanation, flags go up. This is not theory. This is how timeline validation works in every major case. Next comes the corridor review. The route in and out of City Island is limited. That is an advantage for verification. Investigators request nearby traffic and Department of Transportation cameras, any private exterior systems along the approach, and cameras at the bridge and Rodman's Neck area that might catch the presence of a 2-up scooter. The canvas is shaped by the minute marks implied by hospital intake. If 2 assailants on a moped truly rolled up on a car during that window, some trace should exist, a headlight signature, a silhouette at the shoulder, a pass-through on a pole camera. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean narratives often collapse under ordinary video. The vehicle is treated as a portable scene. Crime scene personnel log the condition of the interior, assess blood distribution that can suggest where the assault likely occurred, and note signs of struggle or lack thereof. In this phase, nobody speculates about motive. The question is location, inside the stopped car at the junction, or elsewhere, and whether the physical condition of the cabin supports a sudden external intrusion. The aim is narrow. Does the moped robbery scenario leave the kinds of marks that tend to be present in real roadside attacks? While that processing unfolds, detectives re-interview the driver about the precise sequence, when the car stopped, why it stopped, which door opened, whether any property demands were made, and how the knife was introduced. They compare those answers to what the vehicle and cameras will either confirm or undercut. That loop, statement to statement, is routine, and it is where inconsistent details typically emerge. If new details appear only after investigators request specific footage, that is logged. If the account remains static but uncorroborated by video, that is also logged. Either way, the record is built by comparing words to measurable points. Investigators then trace the path to the hospital in reverse. They look for any secondary stops that could extend the clock. They check for fuel purchases or convenience store cameras that might explain delays. If there are none, and the timing still strains the original claim, the story weakens. In towns like these, violence isn't only a headline, it becomes a stress test of the facts. Residents expect answers, families deserve them. The task is to deliver those answers without theater. Parallel steps unfold around the victim. Death notification and next-of-kin interviews are handled with care. In these first hours, loved ones are asked about recent plans, relationship dynamics, and whether a dinner on City Island fit the day. That is not gossip, it is context for last known intentions. Digital preservation orders are initiated for devices to prevent data drift, call logs, messages, maps history, and location breadcrumbs that can place people at the approach, on the bridge, or somewhere else entirely. None of this announces a conclusion. It builds the conditions under which one can be reached. At this stage, the public still hears robbery in early reporting because that is how the lone surviving party framed it. Investigators do not chase a rumor, they test a statement. If the corridor review produces no independent sign of a moped crew during the crucial minutes, the claim becomes an outlier. Outliers are not discarded, they are examined harder. A case like this is assembled in layers, not leaps. We don't need a better story. We need a better match between story and record. That's the working mindset moving forward. No names are introduced in the narration yet because the file is still in its first pivot, from accepting an initial account to challenging it with time, distance, and lens. The goal is simple: one scene, one chain, one truth supported by what the cameras see and the clocks cannot fake. Antonella Contreras Linares was 30, a registered nurse at Mount Sinai Morningside, described by colleagues as reliable with a clean record and predictable routines. For investigators, that reliability is not sentiment, it's baseline. Baseline lets you measure deviation. On Wednesday, September 17, 2025, her day tracks in familiar lines until the evening plan to head towards City Island for dinner. Messages confirm an ordinary rhythm, work concluded, a change of clothes, a brief confirmation about timing. Nothing in her communications shows fear of a third party, a scheduled meet-up with strangers, or a robbery concern. That matters because it narrows risk to people in her immediate orbit and the route they chose. Digital preservation orders are executed early. Her phone is imaged, call detail records, text threads, location breadcrumbs, and maps history are secured. Investigators don't chase speculation about who she was, they pull the last known signals. Her device shows movement consistent with a drive toward Pelham Bay Park and the City Island approach in the evening window already established by hospital intake in this case. There is no independent sign of her arranging to meet unknown riders or selling personal goods, no marketplace chats, no cash pickup. The ordinary nature of those final communications becomes its own data point. Colleagues provide schedule verification. She was on duty earlier in the week, nothing unusual flagged by supervisors. Family confirms that a midweek dinner was a normal choice, not a veiled rendezvous. Friends describe a straightforward communicator who typically shared locations or updates when out late. That kind of detail helps because silence, and a person who usually checks in, can mark the start of the critical window. The last outgoing message on her phone aligns with the time period investigators already derived from the hospital clock. No panic texts. No "we're being followed." The absence of warning language is noted. Her financial footprint for the day is routine. There are basic card taps that match a workday. Nothing suggests a cash withdrawal from meeting strangers. No abrupt purchases like fuel after the alleged attack time that might imply an unlogged stop. When these streams line up, work schedule, texts, card use, the picture gains resolution. There is still an open question about the precise minute of the stabbing and the exact position of the car when it happened, but the broader arc is consistent, a nurse leaving a normal day for a simple dinner plan. Victimology also looks at recent stressors. Family interviews, handled with care, indicate relationship tension in the weeks leading up to September 17th. That is logged as context, not conclusion. It establishes potential for conflict in a small space, such as a car pulled to a shoulder near Park Drive and City Island Road. At this stage, the case file does not declare motive. It records that those who knew her did not expect she would wander off alone at night or willingly meet unknown men on a moped. When you strip away what's unlikely, the focus tightens on what is testable, where the vehicle was positioned, who was present, and how the injuries occurred. Medical facts begin to speak through the initial examination and preliminary autopsy notes, multiple stab wounds, fatal blood loss, and injury patterns consistent with a close-quarters assault. The treating hospital's triage documentation provides objective language on wound locations and severity. Investigators do not need dramatic phrasing, they need the clean description that a chart provides. That chart will later be reconciled with spatter patterns and transfer inside the vehicle, but this section remains anchored on the victim's condition and timing. The documentation also records the driver's forearm cut. Its features will be analyzed later. For now, it is treated as one more data point with a timestamp. Device alignment is where modern cases often turn. If the nurse's phone shows a steady approach to City Island and no divergence into side streets, and if the driver's phone, once preserved, reflects proximity inside the same window, then the claim of a sudden roadside ambush has to find support from something independent, witness vehicles, poll cameras, or environmental sensors. If it does not, investigators reclassify the initial narrative as uncorroborated. Not disproven, yet, just uncorroborated. The language matters because it keeps the process intact and the audience clear on what is known and what is still being tested. There is a human line that cannot be ignored. In American cities, when a healthcare worker is killed after a normal shift, communities rate it as a breach of trust. People who heal others are supposed to make it home. The value here is not in outrage, it's in clarity. Cases like this ask viewers to notice the signs around them, changes in routine, isolated drives, sudden detours. Awareness is not blame, it is prevention. The narrative remains focused on evidence, texts, times, routes, wounds. But the reason for that focus is to honor the person whose last day looked ordinary until it wasn't. By the end of this phase, investigators have a tighter portrait. Antonella's day was typical. Her plan to eat on City Island fits a common pattern. Her communications do not place unknown assailants in her path. The next step belongs to the records that don't have opinions, surveillance logs and device timelines that either build a picture of external attackers or lay bare a different kind of crime that began and ended within the confines of a single car at a single bend. The vehicle is impounded the same night. Technicians document the cabin before a single item is moved. Seat positions, mirror angles, window switches, interior lights, and the state of the doors are photographed and logged. Swabs are taken from contact points that matter in close-quarters assaults: steering wheel, center console, door pulls, seatbelt latches, and the passenger footwell. The mandate is simple: establish whether the injuries described could have occurred during a fast, external attack at the shoulder of Park Drive and City Island Road. Blood distribution inside the cabin becomes the first read. Analysts are not looking for drama, they are looking for direction and proximity. The patterning on the passenger side shows concentration consistent with multiple strikes delivered at short range. There is transfer on high-contact surfaces that suggests sustained presence in the seat rather than a quick reach-in. No one declares motive from this. The question is location and mechanics. Would two men on a moped generate this interior picture without leaving obvious exterior disturbance or forced entry marks? If the answer is yes, the rest of the file must support it. If not, the story is under strain. Gloves, receipts, and loose personal items are logged. Any cutting instrument is handled with chain of custody and sent for trace and print work. The seatbelt webbing is checked for fresh staining or edge fray that might indicate whether the belt was worn at the time of the assault. Door gaskets and exterior handles are examined for blood transfer that would be expected if an attacker reached in from outside. The absence or presence of that transfer is not a verdict, but it shapes the next question: was the stabbing more likely to have occurred inside a closed cabin? While the car is processed, the corridor canvas tightens. Investigators establish a minute-by-minute grid from the attack window back to the hospital intake time. The City Island Bridge is a natural choke point. Cameras facing inbound and outbound lanes give investigators a chance to see whether a two-up scooter entered or exited near the window that matters. Another set of eyes comes from businesses along the approach to Rodman's Neck. Footage is pulled in blocks rather than clips so that analysts can search for a moped pass-through before, during, and immediately after the alleged attack. A pattern emerges in timing. The drive from the pullover zone to Montefiore New Rochelle has a typical range at that hour. The hospital intake places a ceiling on how late the assault could have happened. When analysts overlay the drive time envelope onto the camera grid, some frames become more important than others. If a moped crew was active at the exact bend where the car supposedly stopped, the pair should appear on ingress or egress within minutes. The first pass produces no positive hits on a scooter that matches the claim. That is not the same as no scooter anywhere. It is no scooter in the corridor when it needed to be there. Back at the vehicle, the absence of shattered glass or pry marks at the passenger door is entered into the log. Interior controls show normal wear, not sudden damage. The center console shows trace transfer patterns that will later be compared against medical chart descriptions of wound placement. Again, this is not an essay about bloodstained science. It is a straightforward check. Does the cabin read like a blitz attack from outside or like a close confrontation inside? The more the interior picture points to a contained struggle, the less compatible it becomes with a fast external robbery. Detectives re-interview the driver using the car's condition as a reference. They pin down which door opened, which hand he used to push the door, how he claims to have blocked the knife, and how the forearm was cut. Each answer is compared against the surfaces that carry or do not carry transfer. If the stated movements do not match the places where biological material is actually found, that mismatch is recorded. When answer sets shift to accommodate new facts, those shifts are recorded too. Cases like this are built by reconciling words with the physical world, one small inconsistency at a time. There is a human reality behind these checks. A 30-year-old nurse did not make it to a routine dinner. Families in the Bronx do not need spectacle, they need a record that holds up. In cities like this, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the sense of basic safety. Precision is not coldness. It is respect. Getting the scene right is how you honor someone who is no longer here to explain what happened. By the end of this phase, investigators have two concrete developments. First, the interior of the car reads more like a contained assault than a fleeting reach-in. Second, the corridor cameras that matter do not show a two-up scooter at the right minutes. Neither finding alone decides the case. Together, they push the file away from a roadside robbery and toward a different classification, one that will be tested next against injury characteristics and device timelines. The first medical documents land before sunrise: admission times, triage notes, brief operative attempts, and the pronouncement for Antonella Contreras Linares. They read dry, the way hospital records are supposed to read. For investigators, those entries do two jobs. They fix the latest possible time for the assault near Park Drive and City Island Road on September 17, 2025. And they describe injuries in plain terms that can be matched against what the car interior already suggested: close range, confined space, multiple stab wounds. A parallel line opens on the surviving driver's forearm cut. Clinicians logged location, length, depth, and whether muscle or critical structures were involved. Those basics matter because certain defensive wounds carry typical patterns from blocking or grabbing a blade. Others track more closely to shallow, linear injuries that can be produced by a controlled motion. Detectives don't need a lecture in anatomy, they need a yes or no on whether the features look like an unplanned slash during a struggle or something that could have been produced without an outside attacker. When the medical language leans toward superficial, it is written into the timeline and held up against the story of a sudden robbery ambush. With hospital time set, the surveillance recheck begins. The team runs a second pass on the bridge and approach cameras that bracket the pullover zone, widening the window before and after the hospital intake anchor by a few minutes on either side. The goal is simple: if two men on a moped were anywhere near that bend when they supposedly attacked, they had to approach it and leave it. On a corridor this constrained, that usually means at least one camera should catch them somewhere. Analysts scan for twin headlight signatures, rider postures, and speed profiles that fit a hit-and-go. The second pass reaches the same result as the first: nothing that matches the claim in the minutes that matter. The absence is not victory, it's momentum. Investigators take the intake time, the typical drive duration from the junction to Montefiore New Rochelle Hospital, and the car's likely path, then lock the latest plausible minute of injury. They overlay that minute against the quiet frames where a scooter should have existed. If a motorbike was present, something about it should have left a trace: an approach, a crossing, a departure. If nothing appears, the claim remains uncorroborated. The record doesn't need a better story, just a better match. That's the benchmark, especially when a victim cannot speak for herself. Back at the impound, the driver's account is compared line by line to the physical record. Which hand he used to block, where his arm met the blade, the exact motion he describes, all of it is checked against contact points inside the cabin. If the cut's position and angle don't align with the claimed movement inside a right-hand drive block or a door-open reach, the discrepancy is logged. The seatbelt latches are revisited to determine whether restraint was worn at the time. If a blitz attack happened from outside, belts and door edges often show active transfer. Here, the cabin still reads like a contained struggle, not a fast reach-in. The preliminary autopsy adds clarity without graphic detail. Multiple stab wounds, rapid blood loss, and no firearm injury. The wound distribution supports a close encounter where the assailant had sustained access, not a single strike and run. The finding dovetails with the car's interior story: concentrated staining in the passenger area, standard transfer on high-touch surfaces, and no exterior damage that would imply forced contact by a person leaning halfway into a moving or recently braked vehicle. None of these notes announce motive. They identify conditions that must be present if the robbery claim were true, and conditions that are not. Digital steps continue in the background. Phone preservation from both parties allows a basic test: device proximity through the evening, message timing around the dinner plan, and any gap that could signal an unaccounted stop. So far, her device behavior tracks a straightforward route toward the City Island approach, while nothing places unknown riders into her communications. If an outsider crew staged a hit, they left no prior trace in her world and no visible imprint on the corridor the moment it counted. The human part of this is simple. A nurse with a normal Wednesday ended up in a hospital not as staff but as a patient. Families watching cases like this don't need cinematic language, they need the confidence that each layer was checked without bias. In towns like these, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Precision is a form of respect. It reduces guesswork and forces the narrative to stand up to the only judge that matters in the early days, the record. By the close of this phase, the file has moved. Medical documentation supports a confined, close-quarters assault. The driver's forearm injury reads shallow for a fight that supposedly erupted without warning. The second surveillance pass repeats the first conclusion, no moped at the right minutes on a route where it should have appeared. None of those facts declare guilt on their own. Together, they pull the case away from a street robbery and toward a domestic incident set inside a single vehicle at a single bend. The next step is predictable and necessary, put the relationship under the microscope and test whether recent conflict aligns with what the evidence already says. By the end of day one, the street robbery frame is no longer driving the file. The next step is the relationship itself. Detectives meet with family and friends who knew how the couple functioned when things were good, and how they sounded when things were not. The picture that emerges is simple and specific, a breakup in progress, recent arguments, and a plan to talk that Wednesday evening. No one mentions outside threats, arranged meetups, or debt to unknown riders. That matters because risk often lives closest to the victim, not out on a random corner. Device preservation turns interviews into timestamps. The nurse's last messages are practical and calm, consistent with an ordinary midweek plan. The companion's phone is pulled under warrant and reviewed for the same window, texts, calls, location pings. Investigators look for any outreach to third parties that could support a robbery scenario. Nothing lines up. There is no heads up to friends about a dangerous stop, no distressed message after the alleged ambush. The silence isn't proof on its own, but it pairs with the corridor cameras already showing no moped in the minutes that count. Re-interviews follow a tight script. Where exactly did the conversation in the car turn? Which words were exchanged? Did either person step out? Was a belt on? Which door opened? The companion's answers are compared, not to theory, but to what's already fixed in the record. The car's interior read as a contained struggle, the bridge approach did not capture a 2-up scooter at the right time, and hospital intake boxed in the latest possible minute of injury. When answers shift to accommodate those anchors, the shifts are logged. When answers stay the same but still fail to match the anchors, that is logged too. The point is not to trap someone in phrasing, it's to force the story to match the clock. A short, factual review of recent contacts fills in the motive window without dramatics. Friends recall tension about independence and space. Family notes concern over escalating arguments. No one offers a text or voicemail warning about a robbery crew haunting the City Island bend. In cases like this, investigators do not need a confession to proceed, they need a pattern that aligns with the physical and digital trail. Here, the pattern is pointed inward, an intimate dispute on a narrow road, a fatal outcome inside a vehicle, and an explanation that leaves no trace on the route in or out. The digital trail adds one more layer, movement data that keeps the two phones together in the approach window and does not reflect a pause for third-party interaction before the hospital drive. If an ambush had occurred, there would typically be a burst of unplanned calls, erratic movements, or at least a contact attempt to a friend or relative. Instead, the trip reads like a direct run after a critical moment inside the cabin. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean stories can be the ones that avoided friction with reality. Investigators also look at what happens after. Post-incident behavior often clarifies intent, how the companion speaks about the victim, the choice to drive past closer emergency options or call no one, and the lack of outreach to potential witnesses who could support a robbery claim. None of these are convictions, they are indicators. Stacked next to the injuries, the car, and the empty corridor, they tilt the frame from struck by strangers to violence between two people who knew each other. There is room here for a human truth that doesn't undercut the evidence. Breakups create pressure. In private spaces, that pressure can explode. Communities don't need lectures, they need the warning signs named plainly so they're recognized earlier, arguments that don't de-escalate, isolation in a confined space, routes with few witnesses. Awareness is not a verdict. It's a way to keep small tensions from turning into headlines. By now the file is ready to move from suspicion to action. The case no longer treats the moped claim as a viable path. The classification shifts toward domestic homicide, supported by the physical cabin, the medical record, the camera gaps, and the relationship context. The next move belongs to the detectives and the prosecutors who will sign their names to it. 2 days after the killing, detectives move from testing a story to acting on a file. On September 19th to 20th, 2025, the investigation formalizes what the evidence has been saying. The man who drove to the hospital is taken into custody in the Bronx. His name is released, Franklin Battles, 44. Prosecutors file counts that match the case's physical spine: second-degree murder, assault, and criminal possession of a weapon. The public narrative shifts in one sentence. Police state there was no moped attack at the bend where Park Drive meets City Island Road, and the driver's forearm cut is self-inflicted. A claim becomes a matter of record, not because anyone said so, but because the cameras, minutes, and wounds refuse to carry it. Arrest day is not theater. It's paperwork, chain of custody, and a first appearance where charging language is read into a courtroom microphone. The timeline is stamped: incident on Wednesday, September 17th, arrest and charges by the weekend, status as of October 25th, 2025, charged, not convicted. The message to the community is equally plain. What began as a reported street robbery is now identified by authorities as a domestic homicide inside a vehicle. The corridor that once had residents looking for strangers is reframed: there were no strangers to find. The file that supports these charges is straightforward. The car reads like a contained assault. The bridge and approach cameras do not produce a two-up scooter in the critical minutes. The preliminary autopsy confirms multiple stab wounds consistent with sustained access, not a single passing strike. The digital trail keeps both phones together with no third-party meetup. The driver's wound lacks the depth and pattern typical of an unplanned block. Each line is modest on its own. Together, they close the door on the robbery story the same way a seatbelt buckle clicks shut, deliberate, audible. At arraignment, the language is tight. Prosecutors outline the sequence without color: a couple in a breakup, an argument in a car, a fatal stabbing, and a staged account that does not survive routine checks. Defense counsel does what the Constitution demands: guard the presumption of innocence, resist conclusions from early reports, and remind anyone listening that a charge is not a verdict. That reminder matters here. The point of saying the word charged is not to collapse a case into certainty. It's to mark where the burden of proof now sits and how the next steps unfold: grand jury, discovery, motions. Out on City Island and around Pelham Bay Park, the quick turn from street fear to domestic reality is its own kind of whiplash. People can handle bad news; what unsettles them is randomness. When the random is removed, what remains is harder to talk about because it happens behind doors and inside cars. That's where prevention lives, in recognizing when a conversation is no longer safe, in refusing isolated routes when emotions are running high, and in remembering that help exists even when the situation feels personal. Awareness is not accusation, it's airflow in a closed room. With Battles named and charged, the case stops chasing ghosts and starts building a presentation for court. The same anchors we've followed from the first minutes: one scene, one hospital, one mechanism, one chain of movement, now support one ending for this story arc. Authorities reject the moped account and move forward on a domestic violence homicide theory. There are no alternate finales waiting at the end of this series, no second suspect montage, no split track. The integrity of the narrative is the integrity of the evidence. In New York, second-degree murder is plain in the statute: an intentional killing without premeditation. On the weekend of September 19th to 20th, 2025, that is the charge prosecutors file in the Bronx against Franklin Battles, 44, after detectives briefed them on what the record already showed. The claim of a roadside ambush is formally set aside. Authorities state there was no moped attack near Park Drive and City Island Road, and the driver's forearm wound is self-inflicted. The case posture becomes clear and single-track, a domestic homicide inside a vehicle, not a random street crime. From there, the process is mechanics, not theater. The defendant is arraigned. The presumption of innocence stays intact. Prosecutors prepare a grand jury presentation that is chronological and narrow: the established location, the fixed time window, the hospital intake clock, the camera review, the injury findings, the device timelines, and the post-incident conduct. They do not need flourish. Jurors, when convened, will be asked a simple question framed by law: do these independent points, laid in order, show intent to kill beyond a reasonable doubt? Discovery is the next word that matters. The state turns over reports, footage, lab results, and interview summaries. Defense counsel examines every minute and every surface, looking for suppression issues, what came in lawfully, what did not, and leverage on admissibility. Motions will test edges, scope of warrants, phrasing in interviews, expert foundations for medical and digital conclusions. That is how American cases move: claim, test, charge, and then adversarial review, all before a jury ever hears a word. The community piece is brief and real. Antonella Contreras Linares, 30, a registered nurse at Mount Sinai Morningside, did not make it to a midweek dinner. Colleagues mourn a caregiver, neighbors try to understand how a quiet bend in the Bronx became a crime scene. When random is ruled out, what remains is harder to discuss because it happens between people who know each other. Awareness helps more than speeches. Do not choose isolated routes when emotions are high. Tell someone where you are going. Step out of a car when an argument will not de-escalate. Call 911 sooner than you think you should. None of that assigns blame to a victim. It names lifelines that exist before headlines do. By October 25th, 2025, this is where the case sits: charged, not convicted. The defendant is in custody while proceedings continue. No alternate suspect lines are open. No second ending is proposed. The narrative remains exactly what the file supports: one scene at the City Island approach, one mechanism, stabbing, one chain of movement to Montefiore New Rochelle Hospital, one defendant now facing murder in the second degree, assault, and criminal possession of a weapon. The initial story given to police did not survive contact with clocks, cameras, and charts. That is why charges were filed. There is a final point worth stating without drama. Precision is a form of respect. It respects the victim by refusing rumor. It respects the accused by insisting on lawful process. And it respects the audience by drawing a line between what is known and what is not yet decided in court. When this case moves again, grand jury votes, motions are argued, hearings scheduled, the updates will change the posture, not the past. The past, for this series, is fixed: Wednesday night, September 17th, 2025, a pullover near Park Drive and City Island Road, a drive to the hospital, a story that collapsed, an arrest that followed. I'm leaving you with this: facts win. When stories wobble, clocks, cameras, and medical charts don't. In a country that trusts process, we protect each other by naming risk early: leave the car, call 911, tell someone where you're going. That isn't blame, it's care. What's your take? Did any moment in this case change how you'd handle a heated argument or a late-night drive? If this resonated, drop a comment with your thoughts and where you're watching from. If it didn't, tell me why. And if you found value here, hit subscribe to follow the next case.